April 12, 1864. A bluff above the Mississippi River. Nearly 300 men lie dead in the mud, and most of them died after they had already surrendered. Soldiers begged for their lives with empty hands raised in the air, and they were shot anyway. Some were buried alive, nailed to logs and set on fire, or dragged into tents that were then burned to the ground with the wounded still inside. This was not a battle. A battle had already happened and ended. What came next was something else entirely, and the men who lived through it never stopped trying to tell the country what they saw. For over a century, most of the country refused to listen. Fort Pillow does not appear in the textbooks the way Gettysburg does. It does not have the monuments or the reenactments or the gift shops. But ask any historian who has actually read the survivor testimony, and they will tell you this: what happened on that bluff in Tennessee may be the single most disturbing afternoon of the entire Civil War. This is the story of Fort Pillow, and the day the war stopped being a war. To understand how a Tuesday afternoon in West Tennessee turned into a massacre, you have to understand what Fort Pillow actually was and who was defending it. The fort sat on a bend of the Mississippi River about 40 miles north of Memphis, built early in the war by Confederate forces and later occupied by the Union. By 1864, it had become a garrison of a little over 600 men, and roughly half of that garrison was made up of United States colored troops, formerly enslaved men from Tennessee who would put on a Union uniform for the first time in their lives. The other half was a unit of white Tennessee Unionists, men from the same hills and towns as many of the Confederate soldiers who would soon be marching toward them. In the eyes of the Confederacy, both groups were considered a kind of betrayal. The white Unionists were seen as traitors to their state. The black soldiers were seen as something worse. The Confederate government had already declared months earlier that black soldiers captured in uniform would not be treated as prisoners of war under the normal rules. Some would be returned to slavery. Some, the policy implied, might not be taken alive at all. That policy was sitting quietly in the background of every black soldier's service, an unspoken sentence that hung over men who had already risked everything just by picking up a rifle. The man who arrived at Fort Pillow that April morning was Nathan Bedford Forrest, and by 1864, his name alone could empty a room of Union soldiers. Forrest was, by nearly every account from both sides, one of the most gifted cavalry commanders the war produced, a man with no formal military training who outmaneuvered West Point graduates again and again through sheer instinct and audacity. He was also, before the war, one of the wealthiest slave traders in the American South, a man who built part of his fortune buying and selling human beings in Memphis. He arrived at Fort Pillow with somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 cavalrymen, vastly outnumbering the garrison inside. The fighting that morning was fierce, but fairly conventional by Civil War standards. Forrest's men pushed the Union defenders back toward the bluff, picking off officers, tightening the noose. By early afternoon, the position was hopeless. The fort could not hold. Its commander, Lionel Booth, was already dead, killed by a sharpshooter's bullet earlier that day, and the men left in charge understood the math as clearly as Forrest did. What happened next is where the story splits into two versions, and where for over 150 years, the argument has never fully gone away. At some point in the early afternoon, Forrest sent a message under a flag of truce, demanding unconditional surrender and warning that he could not be responsible for what happened to the garrison if his men had to take the position by force. That warning would later be pointed to by Forrest's defenders as evidence that fair notice was given, that the Union commanders were the ones who gambled and lost. What that reading leaves out is what unfolded in the minutes immediately after the flag of truce came down. Confederate soldiers found new ground, closer to the fort, while the negotiation was still technically underway, and then, whether by a shouted order or simply by an unleashed momentum that no officer bothered to stop, they came over the walls. What the survivors described next is not the language of combat, it is the language of hunting. Union soldiers, having already thrown down their weapons, were shot where they stood. Men ran for the river, trying to escape down the steep bluff toward the water, and Confederate soldiers followed them down, firing into their backs the entire way. Wounded men lying on the ground, unable to lift a weapon, were shot again, closer this time to make sure. A black sergeant testified afterward that he watched a group of Confederate soldiers pull wounded men from a hospital tent, stand them against a tree, and execute them one at a time. Another survivor described being nailed to the wooden planks of a building alongside other wounded men before Confederate soldiers set the building on fire. Congressional investigators who arrived weeks later found bodies that had clearly been buried while still breathing, arms twisted upward as if reaching for air that never came. The killing did not stop with sundown. It continued into the evening and, according to multiple accounts, resumed again the following morning when Confederate patrols found survivors who had spent the night hiding in the brush and the river mud and shot them there too. The numbers alone tell you something is wrong with the ordinary math of a Civil War battle. Union casualty rates for battles in this period, even brutal ones, typically ran somewhere between 10 and 30%. At Fort Pillow, out of roughly 585 to 605 men in the garrison, well over 300 were killed. That is a casualty rate approaching 60%, an almost unheard of figure for men who were, by every account, in the process of surrendering. And the numbers get darker the closer you look. Confederate losses in the fighting were minimal, somewhere around a few dozen killed and wounded total. In a genuine battle, in an exchange of gunfire between two armed forces, casualty numbers tend to move together. When one side loses hundreds and the other loses almost nothing, you are no longer looking at a fight. You are looking at an execution. And when investigators broke the numbers down further, the racial pattern became impossible to ignore. Roughly 2 out of every 2 white soldiers in the garrison survived to be taken prisoner. Fewer than 1 in 3 of the black soldiers did. Word of what happened at Fort Pillow spread through the North with a speed and a fury that surprised even Lincoln's own cabinet. Newspapers ran the survivor accounts within days, and "Remember Fort Pillow" became a rallying cry printed on regimental flags and shouted by black soldiers marching into later battles, a phrase that told Confederate forces exactly what kind of surrender they could expect from men who had heard what happened on that bluff. Congress launched an official investigation, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which took extensive sworn testimony from survivors, from Confederate deserters, and from local civilians. Their report, delivered within weeks, concluded flatly that a massacre had taken place, and that black soldiers in particular had been targeted for execution after surrender. Lincoln himself weighed in privately, discussing with his cabinet whether the United States should begin executing Confederate prisoners in retaliation, a policy that was ultimately never adopted, in part because Lincoln worried it would simply drag the Union down to the same moral floor. Forrest's own defense, offered both at the time and for the rest of his life, was that no massacre occurred at all, that the casualties were simply the natural and tragic result of a garrison that refused a fair surrender demand and then panicked when the walls were breached. He pointed to the chaos of close combat, to soldiers fleeing down a steep bluff in confusion, to the difficulty any officer has controlling men in the adrenaline of an overrun position. There is a kernel of truth buried inside that defense. Some of the killing in the first minutes after the walls fell probably was the ordinary, brutal chaos of combat, men shooting at other men who hadn't yet fully processed that the fight was over. But that explanation collapses under the weight of what came afterward. It does not explain wounded men shot a second time at close range. It does not explain men executed the following morning, hours after any reasonable confusion should have cleared. It does not explain the racial gap in the casualty numbers, a gap that mere battlefield chaos has no mechanism to produce. Confusion does not sort its victims by the color of their uniforms and the color of their skin. Only intention does that. The most haunting part of the Fort Pillow story is not the massacre itself. It is what happened to the memory of it in the decades that followed. Nathan Bedford Forrest went on to become a founding figure of the original Ku Klux Klan after the war, a fact that once you know what happened on that Tennessee bluff, stops feeling like an unrelated footnote and starts feeling like a straight line.
And yet, in the decades after Reconstruction, as the South rebuilt its own version of the war's history, Forrest was recast almost entirely as a battlefield genius, a folk hero of cavalry tactics, with statues raised in his honor across Tennessee and beyond. The Fort Pillow Massacre, when it was mentioned at all in the mythology that grew up around him, was treated as Northern propaganda, an exaggeration invented by a Northern press machine looking for a villain. Generations of American schoolchildren learned about Forrest's tactical brilliance without ever hearing the name Fort Pillow spoken in the same classroom. It took modern historians, working carefully back through the original congressional testimony and cross-referencing it against Confederate soldiers' own letters home, many of which described the killing in almost gleeful detail, to finally rebuild the case that Southern memory had spent a century trying to erase. What makes Fort Pillow worth understanding today isn't just the horror of one afternoon in 1864. It's what the massacre reveals about the war itself. A war that Americans like to remember as a clean contest of armies and strategy, blue against gray, fought by honorable men on both sides who simply disagreed about the future of the country. Fort Pillow is the place where that comfortable story breaks down completely. It shows you a war where the color of a soldier's skin could determine whether his surrender was accepted or whether it got him killed. Where the rules of combat that protected one group of prisoners simply evaporated for another. The men who died on that bluff were not casualties of confusion. They were men who put down their weapons, who raised their hands, who did every single thing the laws of war asked of them. And it was not enough to save them. Their names are mostly lost to history now, recorded only in the terse, clinical language of a congressional report that most Americans have never read. But the men who survived made sure, for the rest of their lives, that the world knew what really happened there. They carried it with them into every battle that followed, into the years after the war, into old age, telling anyone who would listen that Fort Pillow was not a battle. Remember it not as a footnote buried in the story of a brilliant cavalry commander, but as what it actually was. The day several hundred American soldiers surrendered to their countrymen, and their countrymen killed them anyway. Consider what it actually meant for the men inside that garrison to be there at all. Many of the black soldiers stationed at Fort Pillow had been enslaved on plantations within a day's ride of the fort itself. Some of the Confederate cavalrymen charging up that bluff had grown up on those same plantations, had known some of these men by name before the war, had perhaps once given orders to men who were now standing across from them in Union blue, holding rifles. That detail is not incidental. Several survivor accounts describe Confederate soldiers shouting the names of men they recognized in the moments before killing them, treating the uniform not as a soldier's protection, but as a personal insult that demanded an even more personal punishment. This was not an anonymous clash between strangers from distant states. In places, it was a settling of scores between men who had once lived within shouting distance of each other. One side now free and armed, the other side determined that this new arrangement would not be allowed to stand. The physical geography of Fort Pillow made the killing almost mechanical in its efficiency. The fort itself sat atop a bluff nearly 80 feet above the river, with a narrow strip of land between the base of the bluff and the water's edge. Once Confederate soldiers breached the walls, panicked Union defenders had almost nowhere to go except down that slope, funneling themselves into a killing ground with the river at their backs and armed men above them on higher ground. A few desperate soldiers tried to swim for a Union gunboat anchored offshore, hoping its guns might cover their retreat or that its crew might pull them from the water. The boat's crew, uncertain in the chaos about who was who below them, held their fire for long stretches rather than risk hitting their own men. And by the time the situation clarified, many of the swimmers had already been shot in the water or drowned trying to escape gunfire they could not outswim. Survivors later testified that Confederate soldiers stood at the top of the bluff picking off men in the river as if it were target practice, some of them laughing while they did it. The testimony gathered by the Congressional Committee reads, even today, like something that should not exist in an official government document. One witness testified that he had been shot and while lying wounded on the ground, watched Confederate soldiers walk from body to body, checking for signs of life, delivering a second shot to anyone who moved or made a sound. A civilian witness called before the committee described watching soldiers drag men into a nearby ravine and set fire to brush piled on top of them, some of the men underneath still alive and audibly crying out. Another witness described a young drummer boy shot dead where he stood, his hands empty, his drum still hanging from its strap. These are not the details of an army securing a position. They are the details of men who had decided, individually and collectively, that the ordinary rules no longer applied to the people in front of them.
It would be a mistake to treat this as an isolated event, a single dark afternoon disconnected from everything around it. Fort Pillow sits inside a broader and deeply uncomfortable pattern that runs through the last 2 years of the Civil War, a pattern historians have only fully reconstructed in recent decades by cross-referencing dozens of smaller, less famous engagements. At the Battle of the Crater outside Petersburg, Black Union soldiers who tried to surrender were shot or bayoneted by Confederate troops enraged at seeing them in uniform at all. At Poison Spring in Arkansas, Confederate cavalry killed wounded black soldiers where they lay on the field rather than allow them to be taken prisoner. At Saltville in Virginia, wounded black soldiers left behind in a field hospital after a battle were murdered in their beds the following day by Confederate raiders who rode specifically to finish what the fighting had left undone. None of these incidents received the same level of immediate national attention that Fort Pillow did, in part because Fort Pillow happened to occur at a moment when the Northern press was primed to cover it and Congress was primed to investigate it. But taken together, they describe something far more disturbing than a single commander's failure to control his men in the heat of one battle. They describe an unofficial but widely understood standard among certain Confederate units that a black soldier captured in uniform was not entitled to the protections a white prisoner would automatically receive, and that killing him after he had surrendered was at minimum something that would not be seriously punished by his own commanders. The soldiers who survived Fort Pillow did not get to simply move on from what they had witnessed. Many of the survivors, black and white alike, were reassigned to other Union units and fought in battles for the remainder of the war, carrying what they had seen into every subsequent engagement. Union commanders reported that news of Fort Pillow spread. Black regiments in particular fought with a ferocity and a refusal to surrender that unsettled even their own officers, men who had concluded, correctly, that capture might carry a death sentence regardless of the rules of war. Remember, Fort Pillow was not simply a slogan printed on cloth. It was a statement of fact about how these men now understood their own situation on any battlefield where they might face capture. Some historians have argued that this shift in black soldiers' willingness to fight to the death rather than risk surrender measurably changed the character of combat in the war's final year, hardening engagements that might otherwise have ended with prisoners taken on both sides. The post-war fate of the men responsible for Fort Pillow adds one more layer of bitterness to an already bitter story. No Confederate officer was ever formally tried or punished for what happened on that bluff. The war ended a year later with the entire Confederate command structure absorbed back into general amnesty, and the question of individual accountability for Fort Pillow simply evaporated into the larger political project of reunification. Forrest himself lived another 12 years after the war, long enough to become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan during its founding years in Tennessee, presiding over an organization built explicitly to terrorize the same population his cavalry had cut down on that riverbank. He later claimed, in his final years, to have disavowed the Klan and even gave a speech expressing reconciliation toward Black Americans, a speech some modern defenders point to as evidence of a changed man. Historians remain sharply divided on how sincerely to read that late-life gesture, particularly given how much of Forrest's public reputation by then depended on softening the edges of exactly what he had done both during the war and immediately after it.
For most of the 20th century, the burden of keeping Fort Pillow's memory alive fell almost entirely on Black historians and Black communities, working largely outside the mainstream Civil War history establishment that was, for decades, dominated by scholars sympathetic to a far gentler version of the war's legacy. It was not until the Civil Rights era, and more fully in the decades since, that Fort Pillow began working its way back into serious academic study, and eventually into public consciousness. The site itself is now a Tennessee state park, and a small interpretive center there finally tells a version of the story closer to what the survivors actually testified to in 1864, rather than the sanitized battlefield narrative that dominated for 100 years. But even now, most Americans who can recite the order of battle at Gettysburg from memory have never heard the name Fort Pillow at all. That imbalance is not an accident of historical importance. It is the result of a century of deliberate curation about which parts of the Civil War the country wanted to remember and which parts it found more convenient to forget. What lingers, in the end, is not just the brutality of that one afternoon, but the question it leaves sitting in front of anyone who studies it seriously. A country that fought a war partly over whether Black Americans could be treated as property is the same country that, within that same war, produced soldiers willing to murder Black men in Union uniform after they had already surrendered, and then spent the following century building statues to the man who led them. Fort Pillow forces you to hold both of those facts at once. The courage of the men who stood at that garrison, knowing exactly what capture might mean for them, and the willingness of the men who overran them to prove that fear justified. It is, in its own terrible way, one of the truest snapshots the Civil War ever produced. A moment when the war's stated ideals and its actual conduct on the ground pulled in two completely opposite directions, and the men on that Tennessee bluff paid the price for the gap between them.